Welcome everybody to this session about open source contribution policies that don't suck. My name is Tobie Langel. I'm the principal at UnlockOpen, a boutique consulting firm that I founded a few years ago and that focuses on helping companies and organizations with their open source strategy. I usually start this talk by asking the audience what their open source contribution policy is and whether they have one. And obviously today this is going to be a bit difficult for me to do because this is pre-recorded. So here's data that comes from a survey done in 2018 by a collaboration between the New Stack and the Linux Foundation Studio Group, asking that very same question. And surprisingly, for such a savvy group of respondents, close to half, 48% exactly, did not know whether their company actually had an open source policy or not. And that gets worse if you actually ask, segment the data and ask smaller companies, like with less than 250 employees. Of course, it gets way better and a lot more clear was companies that are large corporations with over 10,000 employees. But even then, I find it kind of surprising to figure out that a quarter of employees of those don't know whether they have an open source contribution policy or not. And it's even more concerning when you actually realize that this is a super biased sample, right? We've asked essentially developers through channels like the Linux Foundation and the New Stack, which are very open source savvy, very tech savvy. Right? Anyway, that begs the question as to what not having an open source policy mean. That's best answered, in my opinion, in the words of Heather Meeker, one of the most famous open source attorneys out there, who wrote, you have a policy whether it is written down or not, right? And that policy could range from no open source at all to anything goes. But what's important to know is, this policy exists in any cases, right? So we already have a good sense of what not having one means. It actually means that you have one, but that it's not done explicitly. Now let's look at what actually having a policy means. I'm sure you all felt kind of proud to know that your company did have a policy. Well, it turns out that that's a good condition, but not a sufficient one, right? You can have a policy, but this policy can be super restrictive. It can be highly bureaucratic. It can be super opaque. And none of these are fun. And so having a policy is not enough, right? You want a policy and you want a good one. And I think the best way of looking at that is to graph where you stand on a graph on which the y-axis, a 4-quadrant graph in which the y-axis goes from implicit to explicit and the x-axis from restrictive to permissive. If we place a couple of company types in there, we'll find small and medium businesses to be in the permissive but implicit sector, right? Startups will tend to be less explicit about things than small businesses and also less permissive, right? Which is normal because they will tend to be more product focused. Non-tech enterprise will be in the highly restrictive and generally sort of implicit quadrant. In that they will tend to just reject open source and block and not even bother writing about it anywhere. If you move to the 4th quadrant, this is where you'll find the old tech companies. Oracle would be there. Old Microsoft would be there. And if you go to the extreme top left, you will find patent trolls, right? Extremely explicit about their what they're trying to do here, and super restrictive. And of course, the good place to be in the 1st quadrant, which is explicit and permissive, this is where you will find modern tech companies. And at the top right-hand corner, you will find trendsetters. Let's have a look at the life cycle of a company, for example, a startup. So what happens with a startup? Well, as I said, it starts to be sort of like implicit and restrictive, and as it grows into a bigger company, it will bring in engineers from outside that start to work on things that are not essentially the core product anymore. For example, tooling or infrastructure, right? And these engineers will tend to be less product focused and more focused on general engineering practices. And as a result, will probably have a stronger open source culture and will tend to contribute more. So whereas the policy might not really become that more explicit, it will clearly become more permissive. And then there's going to be an event in the company that is going to dramatically change the way that open source is done and perceived in the company. And that could be a merger, could be an acquisition, could be a seed round. It's an event that requires the company, to the startup that has grown, to clean its house up. And for that, it's going to hire its first IP counsel, or its first counsel. And the trend here, very unfortunately, is that this will create a ton of explicitness in the company, but will add a ton of restrictions around practices. Right? This is unfortunate and all too common. What you'd like to see instead at that point is more explicitness, absolutely, but not at the cost of permissiveness. Let's now look at old tech companies like Oracle or Microsoft from 2010 or so, right? These were restrictive, explicit companies in terms of open source. And as they sort of modernize and adopt inner source and then more open source practices and a stronger open source culture, they will make their open source policies more permissive. Non-tech enterprise, which now just has figured out over the last decade that it actually has to become tech or be displaced, will tend to become more explicit with their policies as they start building their engineering department and changing the engineering department's name from IT to engineering. And here again, the ideal path is not just going up, it's going in diagonal all the way to the explicit and permissive first quadrant. All right, so I think you got the message. The first quadrant, where you have explicit and permissive open source policies, is usually the best place that you want to go to if you are trying to build a strong open source culture and an innovative, engineering-driven organization. All right, let's now look at what exactly is a policy that doesn't suck. And it turns out that the perspective of what that means is going to vary between engineering and legal and business. And so we're going to briefly look at each one of those. From an engineering perspective, a good policy, a good open source policy, is one that is permissive, explicit, informative, and frictionless. And what do we mean by this? Well, permissive, it has to allow open source contributions to be part of day-to-day work, right? It has to allow an open source practice to be part of the engineering culture, part of the DNA of the company, right? And for that to work, it means that engineers need to be trusted and have autonomy around this. So the rules have to be explicit so that they can make the right decision when faced with For example, wanting to or having to patch an open source project that they rely on. But a explicit open source policy by itself, isn't enough. We also want it to be as informative, right? Not only does the policy have to tell you why you're allowed, what you're allowed to do, it has to tell you why, because that helps educate engineers who are then able to make better decisions next time, and bring that knowledge into their decision-making process around architecture, for example. What project should we use? Knowing whether or not we'll be allowed to patch it is an important decision for an engineering team to be able to make. Lastly, of course, you want everything to be as frictionless as possible, right? Avoid red tape, back and forth over email with legal. Just make it dead easy and super fast for engineering to get an answer. Can I use this, or do I need to rely on something else? From a legal perspective, things are a bit different. What is legal trying to do? Well, essentially, they want to minimize risk, right? What that means depends on the project, and the company, right? But common concerns are giving away competitive advantage, giving away IP that can be used defensively, right, or even offensively. Avoid reputational damages, accidentally infringing on the copyright of someone else by including, a copyrighted image, for example, in a repository that you open source. The second aspect that a company's legal team will care about is that it is consistently followed across the company, right? There is nothing worse than having a number of contributors be following the policy in one part of the organization and another set doing something completely different somewhere else, right? So what you want is to know what's going on so that you avoid compliance issues and the risks mentioned above. As a legal team, you'll probably want to be savvy about written information. So, some of the things you'll want to have in written, for example, to have a paper trail for compliance reasons, and others you want, for example, to avoid tripling damages for patent infringements. And I think most importantly of all, what a legal department will want is to avoid drowning critical problems in a sea of menial issues, right? Some licenses can kill your business, right? If you realize suddenly that your whole business is based on a copyleft license, it's a critical piece of the software you're relying on, and you're selling a software and you want to do on-premise, well, you have a really, really big problem that you have to solve suddenly, right? And you don't want to be focusing on answering 25 questions about permissive licenses that your developers are using for tool and lose sight of the critical problem of a more complex license in a key part of your business. What does business want? Well, it wants essentially engineering to be happy, productive, and innovative. It wants the risks to be minimized and well understood. It wants good communication between the different organizations, especially legal and engineering in that case, because good communication is always better than no communication or bad communication. And of course, it wants the open source policy to be aligned with business goals. Why is this so difficult? Well, because at the heart of all of this conversation is a huge tension between legal, that wants to minimize risk, and engineering that wants to maximize velocity, right? Legal that has an oral culture, engineering that has a written and asynchronous culture. Legal that tends to follow a manager's schedule, whereas engineering tends to be on the maker's schedule. Legal that has more of a spectrum thinking, right? In law, everything is in the gray area. It's never yes or no, right? And that, is a real distinction with sort of like the very binary thinking that you often see in engineering. And lastly, legal's role is conservative, whereas engineering is innovative. And so how do you make these two really conflicting cultures come to agreement? Well, first of all, you have to acknowledge that this tension is normal, right? It's checks and balances. It's great to have these two in your organization. You need these two. You need these two different perspectives. They help drive your business in the right direction. And so, as a business leader, as an organization leader, what you want is to listen to both sides. You want to remind both sides that their role is to achieve common business goals. Legal's role is to minimize risk, sure, but that cannot be at the expense of innovation. Likewise, engineering's needs can't be fulfilled at the expenses of the company's survival. So what you want to do here is really find a common ground, and a good policy would actually improve the life of both sides. And lastly, I think you have to also really understand that your policy has to be aligned with business goals. You can't have a very permissive policy if you're essentially a patent troll. That doesn't make any sense, right? And your engineering department has to understand that. This is the company that they have signed up for. And lastly, as part of that, you have to understand that your policy will change with your business. If you are a startup and you end up an incumbent, 2 decades afterwards, well, your open source policy will have seen many, many revisions and will be really, really different from what it was 2 years in, 5 years in, 10 years in, etc. So, what is an open source policy really about? Well, it's essentially about two things. It's essentially about using open source and about contributing back to open source, right? Open source that comes into the company, open source that is produced by the company. Let's have a quick look at using open source first. So it turns out that we've been using open source for over 2 decades at this point, and so it's a well understood problem, which is essentially about using software with licenses that are compatible with your current business model, but also your future business model, right? What might work now as a SaaS, for example, might not when you want to do on-premise in the future. So think about that. And then the second key aspect of using open source, of course, is making sure that you comply with the licenses that you've chosen. Outside of that, there's not much to it really. And so I don't really want to spend more time here because the really interesting, the really valuable part of a policy from my perspective today is the part that lets your engineers contribute to open source. So let's dig into that a bit. And real quickly, we noticed that it's actually way more complicated than we initially thought. As a start, we have to make a distinction between contributions that are made at work as part of your job and those that are made outside of work. Let's start with those. And here, this is another question that I often ask my audience, which is whether the contributions that you make to open source in your free time are actually yours to make. Can you actually do that? And you'll get a whole bunch of different answers when you ask that question. They usually fall into those 4 different categories, which are, yes, I may, but I must ask for permission. Yes, I can, and I do not have to ask for permission. I don't know, and no. There was a study that was done by GitHub in 2017, which asked a similar question to contributors of their open source projects. And it turned out that a good 50% had really open and permissive contribution policies and were basically allowed to contribute to open source as they wanted to. Much more concerning, however, was the fact that 37%, like more than a third of contributors, actually didn't know whether they were allowed to contribute or no, right? And think again that this is a super biased sample. It's actually folks really already contributing to open source projects on GitHub with an open source license, right? And even, despite that bias, well, it turns out that, some folks really weren't sure whether they were allowed to do that or not. And that begs the question, why is there so much confusion about this, right? And it turns out that this really depends on the jurisdiction. Go in France, it's going to be different than it is in Switzerland. It's going to be different than it is in the US, right? And in the USA, it turns out that a lot of companies own their employees' production 24/7. This is not the case in every state. However, for example, in California, IP developed outside of work belongs to employees unless it's on company equipment. And it was pretty much every engineer in Silicon Valley using a company-issued laptop. You can imagine that this is still very commonly a problem, right? And of course, like the consequence of that this makes it way more difficult for employees to contribute to open source. So the common solution to that is to get employees to ask for permission. And most companies have a process for this. The problem is that process will tend to focus on releasing open source software or working on a limited set of pre-approved projects. As soon as you want to contribute to or to work with bigger projects like Node.js, for example, which rely on so many small modules, so many separate dependencies, this whole process tends to break down really, really quickly. So there's a better solution to that, which is called BEIPA, for Balanced Employee IP Agreement. There's the whole text on GitHub. It's a project that was created by GitHub, actually, based on its own IP agreement. And it has really restricted ways in which IP created by engineers belong to the company. Basically, unless you were purposefully building something for the company or that relates to the company's business, then the project is yours, and that makes it really easy for you to contribute to open source on your own time. All right, let's dig into contributing at work now. Right away, we see here more complexity, because contributing at work can be split up into two different parts, one which focuses on releasing new open source software, and the other one which is commonly referred to as patching, i.e. contributing upstreaming bug fixes. Let's look at releasing software first. What you want to do here is, first of all, you want to distinguish large open source projects that you want to promote and organize and get approval around from smaller day-to-day modules. Like one of the rules, for example, that Google uses for this is to say, you don't really need to get legal approval if you're releasing something that has less than 100 lines of code. For larger projects, what you want to offer are well-oiled and well-documented processes, checklists, templates, toolings, etc. Right? You'll find a ton of really good advice on the To The Group's GitHub account and the policies repository. There's great stuff there. Use it. Thirdly, what you want to do is actually offer help to engineers doing the work. Guide them around your process. Make sure it's easy for them. Learn from the friction points and improve it. And lastly, one of the things that you can do instead is to promote working in the open from the get-go, right? It is way, way, way easier to open source a project that is an empty repository than to open source a project that has had thousands of commits from hundreds of different engineers internally. So that's something that you want to consider. And also, it is way easier to build a community around it. All right, so we looked at releasing. Let's look at patching now. So this is by far the most common activity that an engineer in 2020 and beyond will do, and it is the most important one. That is what makes them part of the broader open source community. This experience must be as frictionless and as easy as possible, right? So what you want to do, you want to surface the process by which decisions are made, right? And trust engineers to do the right thing. Again, make it easy for them to know what they're allowed to do and trust that they will do the right thing. This lets legal focus on the difficult cases, as I mentioned before, right? And of course, once you make decisions, you want to cache those. You can even cache them up front, right? But you want to make it, you want to build a prove and deny lists so that, every time someone comes up with more questions, wants to work on a new project, you know what to answer them more quickly because you've done that already, and you've done the due diligence. So today we'll look at what an open source contribution policy looks like, right? It's split up into using open source, a well understood problem, and actually contributing to open source, which itself has outside of work contributions and contributions on the job, which again can be split up between releasing and patching. So that's it? Well, not really. It turns out that you can actually create applications or services out of your policies, right? And make everyone's life way easier in the process. So that allows you to automatically approve requests that meets pre-established guidelines, right? So for example, let's say that you want to approve your engineers to work on anything that has an MIT license and that is on GitHub, right? So you could just have that as a policy in your service. You don't even have to have your legal team look at it anymore, right? That also allows you to automatically reject requests that don't meet your criteria. And if you do that, you want to make sure that you have a way to allow motivated appeals so that your team can go to your legal department and say, well, listen, I know that you have a policy against GPL, for example, but in that particular case, it makes sense. Here's why. Right? And then you want to manually handle all of the other requests that don't meet the block or allow lists. And you want to cache those decisions so you can get more automation over time. Adobe did that a couple of years ago, right? And that allowed them to shorten their review time from basically a week to half a day for all new requests that were not cached, right? And after a few weeks, I think over 95% of requests were cached, and the answer was immediate. And what's really, really interesting about turning your policy into an app or service is that you start to collect data about what your developers and engineers are working on, right? And this helps you understand your open source activity better. It helps you promote it. It helps you connect engineers that are contributing to similar projects, but that don't know that that's what they're doing, right? So there are tons of benefits to this. Please feel free to reach out if you want help setting something like that up or discussing that. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I'd love to help folks get better systems here that simplify their engineers' life, simplify their legal team's life, and make everyone happier and make it easier for their companies to contribute to open source. All right, and with that, I'm done with my talk here. If you have questions, please feel free to email me at tobie@unlockopen.com. I'm happy to help you out. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Bye-bye.